Reese. At first, I thought it was just the old structure groaning under the pressure of the storm. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was faint, almost like a voice, drifting in and out of the noise of the ocean. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, my pulse quickening. No, it's nothing, I told myself. Just the wind. Just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it again, a soft, dragging sound, like something was moving just outside the lighthouse, scraping against the stone. I froze, heart pounding, my mind racing. An animal? Maybe something washed ashore? I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the window, but there was nothing out there, just the churning ocean and the cliffs disappearing into the night. Still, the sound didn't stop. It was faint but steady, like something was scratching at the walls, trying to get in. That's when I felt it, the undeniable sensation that I was being watched. My skin prickled with a cold dread I couldn't explain. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where would I go? I was alone, miles from anyone. I forced myself to stay calm, trying to rationalize it. It's just the wind, I whispered to myself, but I couldn't ignore the heavy weight of fear pressing down on me. As I stood there, staring out into the darkness, the whispering seemed to grow louder, like the wind was trying to speak directly to me, trying to pull me into its grasp. That first night, I was exhausted, physically, emotionally. After a full day of unpacking and setting up my gear, all I wanted was to collapse into bed and let the rhythmic crashing of the waves lull me to sleep. The room at the top of the lighthouse was colder than I expected, a chill that seemed to seep through the stone walls no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in blankets. Lying there, I listened to the waves. They were louder than I imagined, roaring as they slammed into the rocks below. It was almost violent, like the sea was angry at something. I told myself it was normal, this was an old lighthouse, built on the edge of a brutal coastline. Of course the ocean would sound fierce out here. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, something about it didn't feel right. And then, through the relentless roar of the sea, I heard something else. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A distant wail, carried on the wind. I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind picking up speed, maybe the structure groaning under the force of the storm. But as I closed my eyes, trying to settle in, the sound persisted. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. It came in waves, rising and falling, almost in sync with the crash of the ocean. A high-pitched keening, like a cry. At first, I tried to convince myself it was some kind of animal, maybe a seal or a bird. But no. No, it was too human. Too desperate. Like someone out there, in the dark, crying for help. My heart started to pound, the fatigue from the day quickly giving way to a growing sense of unease. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear more clearly, but the wailing didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to be getting louder. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer than it should be, like it was coming from right outside the walls of the lighthouse. Every time the waves crashed, the sound followed, echoing through the darkness, winding its way into my head. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Something wasn't right. Curiosity, or maybe sheer terror, got the better of me. I couldn't just lie there and pretend I wasn't hearing it. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and forced myself out of bed, my legs heavy with dread. The air was colder outside the blankets, biting against my skin as I made my way up the narrow spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse. With each step, the sound seemed to grow louder, clearer. A soft, mournful wail, like someone out there in the blackness was in pain, crying out for someone, anyone, to hear them. When I reached the top, I hesitated for a moment before stepping out onto the small, circular platform. The wind hit me hard, howling through the air, and for a moment I was disoriented. The ocean stretched out endlessly before me, an inky, black void that seemed to swallow the world. I scanned the horizon, swinging the flashlight over the water, desperate to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Just the waves crashing against the rocks far below, the vast emptiness of the sea beyond. But the wailing, it didn't stop. In fact, it was closer now, almost underneath me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back from the edge, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel it, something wasn't right. There was no one out there, but the sound, it was real. Too real. And it was coming closer. I leaned over the railing, my flashlight barely cutting through the mist, and that's when I realized the crying wasn't coming from the ocean at all. It was coming from inside the lighthouse. The next morning, I was still rattled from the night before, barely able to shake the eerie feeling that had settled deep in my chest. The sun had barely risen when the sound of an engine broke through the stillness. It was the fisherman, bringing the week's supplies. I could see his boat bobbing along the waves, getting closer to the shore as I made my way down to the dock to meet him. He was an older man, with skin weathered by the sea and deep-set eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He didn't say much as he unloaded the supplies, his hands working quickly and efficiently, as if he'd done this routine 1,000 times before. There was something about him, an air of quiet knowing, that made me uneasy. As he handed me the last crate, I hesitated. The strange wailing from the night before was still fresh in my mind, and even though I felt foolish bringing it up, I couldn't stop myself. Hey, last night I heard something strange. It was like crying. Out by the ocean. Does that happen a lot out here? Maybe animals or something? I expected him to laugh, to brush it off like it was nothing. But instead, his hands froze mid-motion, and his expression darkened. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared out at the water, his brow furrowed. The silence stretched on for too long, and my stomach tightened with dread. You heard it, huh? He finally said, his voice low and gravelly. There was no trace of humor in his tone. You should be careful what you listen to out here. I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden change in his demeanor. What do you mean? The fisherman set the crate down and looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes. This lighthouse, it's got a history. People round here don't like to talk about it much, but there's a reason no one stays out here long. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. What kind of history? He shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. Long time ago, before the lighthouse was shut down, there was a keeper. Lived here alone for years. They say he was a good man, at first. But something changed. He started hearing things, voices, whispers from the sea. He said they called to him, begged him to come closer. Drove him mad in the end. I felt a chill run down my spine, the cold morning air doing nothing to ease the knot of tension growing in my chest. What happened to him? The fisherman's eyes met mine, and I could see the unease in them. One night, he just walked out into the water. Never came back. Some folks say he drowned. Others say the sea took him, claimed him for itself. But what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They say he still calls out, even now. Crying for anyone who'll listen. Trying to drag them into the waves, just like he was. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. My rational mind was screaming that it was just a story, a local legend meant to scare outsiders. But the look in the fisherman's eyes told me he believed every word. You'd do best to stay inside after dark, he added, his tone grim. And whatever you do, don't listen too closely to the ocean. It ain't always just the wind out there. Before I could ask him anything more, he turned and climbed back into his boat, starting the engine and heading back toward the mainland without another word. I watched him go, the unease in my chest growing stronger. The lighthouse stood tall behind me, its shadow stretching out over the rocky shore, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt a deep, unsettling fear sink into my bones. That night, as the wind picked up and the waves began to crash harder against the rocks, I couldn't stop myself from listening. I tried to block it out, to distract myself with anything else, but I knew I'd hear it again. And I did. The crying came back, louder, more desperate. And this time, it sounded even closer. After the fisherman's warning, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. His cryptic words echoed in my mind, gnawing at my thoughts. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it festered. Something wasn't right here, and I had to know what. So, with a mix of dread and curiosity, I decided to investigate. The lower levels of the lighthouse were cold, damp, and filled with the weight of years long gone. Old wooden crates, rusted tools, and stacks of weathered books cluttered the narrow spaces. Dust hung in the air, and the salty scent of the sea seeped through every crack in the stone walls. I could feel the isolation here, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of solitude, despair, and something darker. I found old logs and journals from past keepers, most of them mundane and technical, recounting daily repairs, weather patterns, and the usual maintenance. But as I dug deeper, one journal caught my eye, its pages more worn than the others, the handwriting erratic, as if the writer had been in a state of panic. My heart pounded as I opened it. The entries started off normal, much like the others, but quickly turned strange. The handwriting grew shakier, the sentences rushed and disjointed. One entry read, "There's something in the sea. I can feel it. It's watching, waiting." My throat tightened as I continued reading. The journal became darker with each page, the keeper's words increasingly frantic. "I see them now, figures in the water. Always just beyond the rocks. At night, I hear them. They call out, whispers on the wind." The words seemed to leap off the page, as if they were written in the heat of terror, the ink smudged from a trembling hand. One particular entry froze my blood. "The ocean comes alive at night. I can't explain it, but I know it's true. It moves, it breathes, like a living thing. And the closer I listen, the more it feels like it's calling to me. Last night, I saw him, standing on the rocks. He looked like me. Same face, same eyes, staring right at me. He beckoned, wanted me to come closer. But I won't. I won't listen. Not anymore." I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. The words on the page felt too real, too vivid. They matched too closely with what the fisherman had said, and the strange cries I'd heard on my first night here. Was this what had driven the previous keeper mad? Was I starting to hear it too? That night, the wind howled louder than ever, and the crashing waves sounded like distant roars. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, just the lighthouse creaking from age, but deep down, I knew better. I knew what was coming. Then it started again. The crying. At first, it was faint, blending with the sounds of the storm, but as the minutes dragged on, it grew clearer. It wasn't just crying anymore, it was a voice. A voice calling out from the ocean, rising above the crashing waves. My chest tightened, every muscle in my body tensing with fear. I told myself not to listen, not to pay attention, but I couldn't block it out. The voice was calling my name. I shot out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran to the window, my hands shaking as I peered out into the black, churning sea. The voice echoed in my ears, closer now, more insistent. I strained my eyes, searching the jagged rocks below the lighthouse, praying I wouldn't see what I feared. But then I saw it. A figure, standing on the rocks, bathed in the faint glow of the lighthouse beam as it swept over the shoreline. And in the brief flicker of light, I saw its face. It was me. I stumbled back, a wave of nausea and terror crashing over me. The figure remained, motionless, its arm outstretched, beckoning me to come closer, just like in the journal. The voice, still calling my name, filled the room, consuming everything. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, the image, the fear clawing at my insides. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. It wanted me. I had to know. I had to face whatever was lurking out there, waiting for me. The voice, the crying, the figure, it had all been leading me to the shore. So that night, I gathered what little courage I had left, grabbed my flashlight, and headed toward the ocean. The wind whipped around me as I descended the cracky steps leading to the rocks, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The sound of the crying echoed over the crashing waves, more desperate and haunting than ever. It tugged at me, pulling me closer, and no matter how much my mind screamed at me to stop, my legs kept moving. When I reached the shore, I could see it, a shadowy figure standing on the rocks just beyond the water's edge. The waves crashed against it, but it didn't move, didn't flinch. It was half obscured by the mist and the violent spray of the sea, but I could see enough to feel my heart drop into my stomach. It wasn't just any figure. It was me. My clothes. My face. My posture. It stood there, staring back at me, but its eyes, they were wrong. Hollow. Empty. As if it were nothing more than a shell of a person. And as I stepped closer, the crying stopped. The air grew still, unnaturally quiet, except for the low whisper that began to fill the space between us. Join me. The words didn't come from its mouth, they seemed to rise from the air itself, twisting around me like the wind. I could feel the pull of the sea at my feet, the cold water lapping at my ankles. The tide was coming in fast, too fast. Panic shot through me, but when I tried to move, my feet felt like they were sinking into the wet sand, the ocean pulling at me like invisible hands. The figure in the water, my reflection, stretched out a hand, beckoning me. Its lips moved silently, repeating the same command. Join me. The waves surged higher, the icy water now pulling at my knees, stronger and stronger, dragging me closer to the edge. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to turn back, but it was as if the sea itself was alive, hungry, pulling me toward it. The wind howled around me, and the rocks beneath my feet became slippery and treacherous. I couldn't breathe. The cold, wet grip of the water seemed to tighten around my legs, making it harder and harder to move. And all the while, the figure remained, standing in the freezing water, its eyes locked on mine. It didn't blink. Didn't move. Just waited, hands still outstretched. In a desperate last effort, I yanked my feet from the sand and stumbled backward, slipping on the rocks as the tide surged around me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled up the shore, every muscle in my body screaming to get away. I could hear the waves crashing louder now, roaring in my ears, as if the ocean itself was enraged that I was escaping. I didn't stop until I reached the lighthouse. My hands fumbled with the door, and I barely managed to slam it shut before the sound of the ocean outside seemed to shake the walls. The voice, it was still there, softer now but unmistakable, carried on the wind. It was calling my name. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling from the cold and terror, my heart racing as I listened to the wailing fade into the distance. Dawn was breaking, but the light didn't bring any comfort. The sea was calm again, the waves lapping gently against the shore as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That figure, was still out there, waiting. Watching. The sea had claimed many before me, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to resist.